There are moments on television that are loud, big laughs, thunderous applause, standing ovations that seem to shake the walls. And then there are moments that are quiet, so quiet that you can hear people breathing. This was one of those moments. The lights were on. The cameras were rolling. Steve Harvey stood in the center of the studio, confident, sharp, familiar, the kind of man who usually controls the room with a single raised eyebrow. But this time, something was different. Nobody spoke. No laughter, no clapping, no nervous coughs, just people standing, watching. Witnesses. You could see it in their eyes. They weren't just an audience anymore. They were frozen inside a moment they didn't expect. And Steve felt it. He paused. Not because he forgot his line, not because a joke failed. He paused because the room had changed. Moments earlier, the energy was playful, easy, comfortable. Steve had been doing what he does best, joking, storytelling, reading the room like a master musician reads notes. Then one sentence landed differently, not louder, not sharper, just truer. It wasn't planned. It wasn't written on a teleprompter. It came from somewhere deeper. Steve looked out at the crowd and realized something was happening. People weren't reacting. They were processing. A woman in the front row had her hand over her mouth. A man near the aisle stopped smiling halfway through a laugh. Someone in the back slowly crossed their arms, as if protecting themselves from a thought they didn't want to face. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was recognition. Steve shifted his weight. He glanced to the side, not at the cameras, but at the people. And he did something rare. He didn't rush. Most hosts would try to save the moment, crack a joke, push forward. Steve didn't. He let the silence breathe. And in that silence, everyone became a witness. You could almost hear thoughts colliding, memories waking up, regrets tapping on shoulders, truths knocking quietly, asking to be let in. Steve spoke again, slower this time, not performing, talking. He said something simple, something that sounded obvious. But obvious truths are often the hardest ones to hear. He talked about expectations, about the stories people tell themselves, about waiting for permission to become who they already are. No yelling, no preaching, just honesty. And that honesty hit the room like gravity. People stopped shifting in their seats, stopped whispering, stopped pretending this was just another show. They stood there, mentally frozen, watching a man say out loud what many of them had been avoiding for years. Steve noticed. His voice softened. He wasn't looking for applause. He wasn't fishing for approval. He was sharing something he himself had learned the hard way: failure, embarrassment, moments when silence followed him too. Not applause. He talked about standing in rooms where nobody believed, about hearing nothing back when you expected cheers, and how silence can either break you or teach you. The room stayed quiet. Not awkward quiet, heavy quiet, the kind of quiet that means something important is happening. Steve nodded slowly, as if acknowledging the weight in the air. He smiled, not his usual big smile, but a small one. Grateful, grounded. He knew this moment couldn't be forced. So he finished the thought, not with a punchline, but with a pause. And that's when it happened. At first, one person moved. Just one. A single clap. Not loud, not dramatic. Then another, and another. People didn't cheer right away. They stood there for a second longer, as if asking themselves whether it was okay to respond. Then the applause grew, not explosive, respectful, real. Steve exhaled. The room had thawed, but everyone knew. They would remember the silence longer than the sound. Applause faded slowly, Not because people were tired, but because no one wanted to be the first to stop. There was a strange respect in the air. Steve didn't bow, didn't raise his hands, didn't soak it in like a victory. He just stood there, still, watching the room the same way the room had been watching him. This is what most people never notice. After moments like this, hosts usually move on. Next segment, next joke, next question. But Steve stayed, because he understood something. That silence had done more than noise ever could. When a room goes quiet like that, people aren't passive anymore. They become witnesses, witnesses to themselves. Every person standing there had just been confronted by a thought they couldn't unhear. Some remembered chances they never took. Some thought about promises they made and quietly broke. Some realized they had been waiting for approval that was never coming. Steve saw it on their faces, the slight tightening of jaws, the distant look in the eyes, the uncomfortable shifting that comes when truth lands too close. He spoke again, softer. He said that silence isn't empty, it's full. Full of answers people already know, but are afraid to say out loud. He talked about fear, not the dramatic kind, but the quiet one, the kind that tells you to wait, to be practical, to stay where it's safe, the kind that sounds reasonable. Steve admitted he listened to that voice for years, years where nothing happened, years where he felt stuck, while pretending he was being patient. The audience leaned in. No phones, no whispers. Witnesses don't look away. He said something that made a few people swallow hard, that the most dangerous lie is believing you have time. Time to try later. Time to fail later. Time to become later. He paused. Let that sink in. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in recognition. Steve didn't point, didn't single anyone out. He kept it universal, because the truth didn't belong to him alone. He talked about rooms he'd been in, rooms where he wasn't welcomed, rooms where nobody clapped, rooms where silence followed his name, and how he learned the difference between being ignored and being tested. Silence, he said, tests commitment. It asks one simple question. Will you keep going even when no one reacts? The room stayed frozen. People weren't standing anymore because of the show. They were standing because sitting felt wrong. Steve looked around again. This time, his eyes didn't rush. He let them travel, from face to face, from story to story. He knew something else too. This silence wouldn't last forever. It never does. Life eventually gets loud again. Distractions return. Doubts creep back in. But moments like this leave a mark. He said that applause feels good, but silence teaches better. Applause rewards you for what you did. Silence asks you who you are. The words landed gently, but firmly. No drama, no hype, just truth delivered without armor. And then he smiled. Not because the moment was over, but because it had done its job. He thanked the audience, not for clapping, not for watching, for listening. That's when something subtle happened. People started exhaling. Shoulders dropped. Faces softened. The room was warming again. But no one was the same as they had been 10 minutes earlier. Witnesses never are. As the show moved on, people laughed again, clapped again. The rhythm of television returned. But beneath the noise, something lingered. A private question, a quiet challenge, one that would follow people home, into cars, into bedrooms, into sleepless nights. Steve knew that too. That's why he didn't try to repeat the moment. You don't recreate silence, you respect it. And somewhere between that frozen room and the final applause, something honest had been shared. Not shouted, not sold, just offered and accepted. People think the moment ends when the cameras cut. It doesn't. For the witnesses, it's only the beginning. After the show, people didn't rush for the exits the way they usually do. They moved slower, quieter. Some walked in pairs but didn't talk. Some stared at the floor, replaying words in their head like a song they couldn't turn off. This is what silence does. It follows you. In the parking lot, engines started, doors closed, phones lit up. But nobody knew what to say, because what had happened wasn't a performance. It was a confrontation. Not with Steve Harvey, with themselves. Steve knew this pattern well. He had seen it before, long before the fame, the suits, the stages. He remembered his own silent rooms, rooms where dreams felt embarrassing to admit, rooms where people smiled politely but didn't believe, rooms where nothing happened and that nothing felt louder than rejection. He once stood in a small apartment with empty walls and a head full of ideas that hadn't earned respect yet. No applause there, no witnesses cheering him on, just silence and doubt. He remembered asking himself the same question everyone in that audience was now asking. What if I'm wrong? What if this dream is just noise in my head? What if the silence is a sign to stop? Steve said the hardest lesson wasn't learning how to speak. It was learning how to stand in silence without shrinking. Most people interpret silence as failure, as judgment, as proof that they don't matter. But silence can also mean something else. It can mean the moment hasn't caught up to the truth yet. Steve told a story about getting fired, about losing a job when he thought he was finally on the right path. No backup plan, no applause, just the echo of a decision that scared everyone around him. People told him to be realistic, to calm down, to stop chasing things that didn't make sense. They weren't cruel, they were afraid. Fear often disguises itself as advice. Steve said that room felt colder than any audience silence, because this time the witnesses were people he loved. And still, he stayed. He didn't win right away. He didn't prove anyone wrong overnight. He spent years in spaces where nothing responded to him, years where silence tested him daily. The audience from the show would understand that soon, because after moments like the one they witnessed, life doesn't magically change. Bills still come. People still doubt. Fear still whispers. But something shifts. Once you've been a witness to truth, you can't unknow it. Steve explained that the applause they gave wasn't for him. It was for recognition. They were applauding the part of themselves that had just been exposed. That's why it felt different. That's why it took time. Applause born from honesty doesn't rush. It hesitates. Because it costs something. He said motivation is loud. Truth is quiet. Motivation excites you for a day. Truth rearranges you slowly. The room during the show had chosen truth. That's why it froze. Because freezing is what happens when the mind catches up to the heart. Steve admitted that even now, with all his success, silence still visits him. Before big decisions, before risks, before stepping into something new. The difference is, he doesn't fear it anymore. He listens. Silence asks better questions than noise ever could. It asks if you're being honest, if you're hiding, if you're waiting for applause instead of conviction. He said the bravest thing a person can do is move without permission. That line stayed with people, because permission is what most of them were waiting for. From parents, from partners, from society, from rooms that stayed quiet too long. Steve looked back at the audience one last time before the break. He knew most of them wouldn't talk about this moment out loud. They'd joke about the show, mention the laughs, downplay the pause. But alone, they would remember. And that was enough, because change doesn't start in crowds. It starts in quiet rooms, with witnesses who stop running from silence and start learning from it. I remember the moment like it happened yesterday. The room fell silent, like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something that nobody quite knew. You could feel it in the air, a heavy, electric tension that made your skin tingle. And there he was, Steve Harvey, standing there in the center, with that expression on his face that meant something big was about to happen. Not a joke, not a punchline, just pure, raw anticipation. You know Steve. He's the man who can fill a room with laughter with just a raise of his eyebrow. But in this moment, there was no laughter. There was only stillness. People froze, their eyes locked onto him like magnets. It was like the entire world had taken a pause. You could hear the faint shuffle of feet, the nervous clearing of throats, but it was so soft it was almost imperceptible. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if he knew every eye in that room was following his every motion. And then he spoke. His voice cut through the silence like a warm ray of sunlight breaking through storm clouds. It wasn't loud, it wasn't shouting, it was just there, commanding, honest. "I've seen a lot in my life," he said, pausing to let the weight of those words sink in. "I've been in front of crowds, in studios, on stages bigger than most of you could even imagine. And yet, there are moments that stop me in my tracks, moments that make me realize this right here is one of them." And that's when it hit me. That's when the room truly transformed. You could feel it in the very air you were breathing. The kind of silence that isn't awkward, but sacred. The kind of silence that comes before a storm, or before a revelation, or before a collective realization that you are witnessing something extraordinary. Steve paused again. Not for effect, not to tease, not to play the audience. Just a pause, a human pause, like he was gathering all the respect and attention that the moment deserved. And then slowly, almost imperceptibly, a shift began. A single clap, somewhere in the back. Hesitant, tentative, but enough to ripple through the room. And then another, and another, until it wasn't just a clap anymore, it was a symphony. A wave of recognition, awe, and appreciation that surged through every single person who had been holding their breath. And Steve, standing there, let that wave wash over him. He smiled, not the smile of a man relieved, but the smile of a man who knew he had just connected with people in a way words alone could never describe. The applause was growing, but the room still felt heavy with that initial silence, like everyone was trying not to let the moment slip away. You could see it on their faces, the mixture of disbelief, admiration, and a kind of reverent awe. It wasn't just about what Steve had said, it was about the way he said it, the presence he commanded without demanding it. I remember the way the camera crews were trying to capture it all, but even they seemed to hesitate, almost afraid that the act of recording might break the spell. And yet every click, every subtle movement of lenses only added to the intensity. There was a rhythm to it, almost like the room itself had become an orchestra, with Steve as its conductor. He looked around, eyes sweeping over the crowd, acknowledging them, not just with words, but with a genuine human connection that is rare to witness. And then he leaned in slightly, his voice dropping, intimate, like a secret being shared with everyone at once. "You know," he said, "life doesn't always give us these moments. Sometimes it throws chaos at us. Sometimes it tests our patience, our courage. But then sometimes it gives us moments that remind us why we're here. why we do what we do. And this is one of those moments. It was quiet again, a quiet filled with reflection. The kind of quiet that makes you suddenly aware of your own heartbeat, the sound of your own breath, the collective rhythm of 100 hearts beating in unison. And in that quiet, you could see people shifting smiles, breaking through, tears forming in the corners of eyes, hands instinctively moving together in claps, even though everyone still felt like they were suspended in that suspended reality. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, the sound started to grow. A few people dared to whisper words of encouragement, murmurs of agreement, and suddenly, the room was alive again. Not in laughter, not in chaos, but in a shared understanding. The kind of understanding that doesn't need explanation. The kind that's felt. Steve's expression changed subtly, just enough to notice. There was that slight arch of his brow, that twinkle in his eye, the hint of a grin that told everyone, yes, we are all here together, witnessing this, and yes, it matters. And as the applause finally swelled to fill the room, as the wave of energy passed from one person to another, you could feel something shift inside yourself, inside everyone there. It was as if the collective silence had given birth to a collective realization. Moments like this don't happen often. Moments like this remind us why we come together, why we watch, why we listen, why we care. And Steve Harvey, he stood there at the center of it all, not commanding, not demanding, simply being. And in that being, he connected every single person in the room in a way that only someone of his presence, his experience, his humanity could do. And then, just when you thought the moment had reached its peak, Steve did something unexpected. He raised his hand, not to silence anyone, not to signal anything, just raised it as if inviting the room to lean in a little closer, to feel the weight of the moment a little more deeply. The room obeyed without thinking. Heads leaned forward, eyes widened, breaths held. There was an unspoken agreement. Whatever was coming next, it mattered. You see, he said, his voice calm but carrying that unmistakable gravitas, life is full of moments that try to stop us. Moments that test our patience, our faith, our belief in ourselves. And sometimes, when we think we've seen it all, something happens that reminds us that there's still magic, there's still wonder, there's still connection. A single tear glimmered on the cheek of someone near the front row, then another and another. The applause softened for a moment, replaced by a collective gasp, a quiet intake of breath that somehow felt louder than any sound. You could see it ripple through the crowd, the effect of one person being moved, translating instantly to everyone else. Steve paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough for every person in that room to feel it, to live in it. It wasn't a dramatic pause, it was a human one, a pause that said, notice this, be here, this matters. Then, with that effortless timing he's known for, he broke the tension with a small, knowing smile. Not a joke, not a quip, just a smile that carried reassurance, acknowledgement, and gratitude all at once. And in that smile, the room seemed to exhale together. People laughed softly, not out of humor, but relief and recognition. Applause began again, slowly at first, then building, filling the space with warmth and life. Cameras captured the moments, but you could tell some of it couldn't be fully captured because what was happening was felt more than seen. It was shared in the subtle shifts of posture, the glimmer in the eyes, the almost imperceptible nods that said, yes, I see it too, I feel it too. And there he stood, Steve Harvey, in the middle of it all, absorbing the energy, giving it back tenfold. His presence was quiet, yet undeniable. His words, though few, carried more weight than any monologue could. The room had frozen once, and now it had melted together into a shared experience, a collective memory that everyone present would carry with them long after they left. And I knew right then that moments like this, moments where the world seems to pause and look at one man and see something greater than himself, are rare, precious, unforgettable. And then, just when you thought the energy in the room had peaked, something remarkable happened. People stopped clapping for a moment, as if collectively realizing that this wasn't just applause for a performance or a speech, it was recognition of a shared human experience. Eyes met eyes across the room. Strangers nodded to strangers. Smiles broke out spontaneously, small and genuine, like sparks igniting one after another. Steve Harvey didn't move immediately. He simply allowed the room to exist in that moment, fully aware of the gravity of what had just unfolded. There was a pause, a pregnant pause, where time itself seemed to bend. It wasn't an ordinary pause. It was the kind that makes your heartbeat sync with the rhythm of 100 others, the kind that reminds you why you came, why you watched, why you believed that something extraordinary could happen in a room full of ordinary people. Then slowly, Steve began to speak again. His voice was softer this time, almost conversational, drawing the room in closer, making everyone feel as though they were part of something intimate, something profound. "You know," he said, "sometimes we wait our whole lives for a moment that reminds us why we're here, why we do what we do, why we get up every morning and keep moving forward even when we're tired, even when we're unsure, even when we feel alone. And this right here is one of those moments." You could see it on the faces around the room, the mix of awe, relief, and deep emotional resonance. Some people shifted in their seats. Others held onto the edges of their chairs as if bracing themselves against the overwhelming weight of feeling seen, heard, and understood all at once. And then the applause returned, hesitant at first, like a river starting to trickle, then growing into a flood. But even in the applause, the room was different than it had been before. It wasn't casual or distracted. It wasn't mechanical. It was heartfelt, deliberate, and unanimous. Each clap was a note in a symphony of recognition. Each cheer was a testament to the power of connection. Steve Harvey let the applause wash over him without interruption. He didn't raise his hand to command it or demand it. He simply allowed it, acknowledging each person in the room with a nod, a glance, a slight smile. And in that, you could see the magic, the ability to transform a simple room of witnesses into a community, into a living, breathing organism that had collectively experienced something unforgettable. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the room calmed again. People settled back into their seats, their faces soft, their eyes bright, their breaths coming a little slower, a little deeper. The kind of silence that returned wasn't empty, it was full, full of reflection, full of gratitude, full of the unspoken understanding that everyone there had shared a moment they would never forget. Steve Harvey finally exhaled, a small, almost imperceptible sigh, and the corners of his mouth lifted into that familiar, reassuring smile. The room had frozen once, and now it had released into something far greater than applause, something that could not be captured on camera, could not be fully expressed in words, but could only be felt, the rare, electric beauty of a moment when everyone truly sees and experiences the extraordinary together. And then, as the room began to settle, a subtle shift occurred. People who had been leaning back, still processing the energy of the moment, began to lean forward again. Not because they were restless, but because something about Steve Harvey's presence demanded attention. It wasn't loud or forceful, it was magnetic. It was the kind of presence that makes you quiet yourself just to feel the gravity of it. Steve's eyes scanned the room slowly, intentionally, as if making sure he connected with each person individually. And in those glances, you could see the recognition, the understanding, the silent communication. We are here, together, right now. This matters. Then, with a gentle smile, he spoke again. This time, his words were almost a whisper, but they carried weight that reached every corner of the room. Life doesn't hand out these moments often, he said. Sometimes it's loud and messy and chaotic. Sometimes it's quiet, unnoticed. But every once in a while, it gives us a pause, a chance to feel, to connect, to witness something bigger than ourselves. And tonight, we all got that chance. A few people shifted in their seats. Others blinked rapidly, trying to hold back emotions. You could hear the soft intake of breaths, the rustle of clothing as people adjusted, trying to stay grounded in the moment. And yet, despite the quiet, the room was alive in a way that was almost palpable. Then suddenly, a laugh erupted. Not a loud laugh, not a forced laugh, but a release. The kind of laugh that comes after holding your breath too long, after holding in too much emotion. And one by one, people began to laugh, softly at first, then more freely, smiles spreading across faces. It was as if the room exhaled together, letting go of the tension, letting go of the awe, letting go of the collective silence that had bound them. But the laughter didn't diminish the moment. It enhanced it. It was joyful acknowledgement, recognition, a way of saying, yes, we felt it too. Yes, we are part of this. Yes, this matters. Steve Harvey let that laughter mingle with the applause, let it flow through the room without interruption. And in that flow, you could see the full arc of what had happened. A room had frozen, a moment had been shared, and a transformation had taken place. People were not the same as they had been when they first walked in. They were part of something larger, part of a shared experience that would linger long after the cameras stopped rolling, long after the applause faded, long after the lights dimmed. And there he stood, Steve Harvey, at the center of it all. Not as a performer, not as a celebrity, but as a human being, connecting with other human beings in a moment that was raw, authentic, and unforgettable. And then, just when you thought the moment had reached its peak, Steve did something subtle but profoundly impactful. He stepped slightly forward, just enough to close the distance between him and the audience. Not dramatically, not theatrically, but intentionally, like a man leaning into the shared heartbeat of the room. You know, he said, voice calm, almost conversational, we spend our lives rushing, chasing, performing, proving, and we forget sometimes to just be, to see, to feel. Tonight, for just a few minutes, we pause together. And that is everything. You could feel it ripple through the crowd. People shifted, nodding slightly, some whispering to their neighbors, others just staring ahead, absorbing every word. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was thick with meaning, thick with connection, thick with the collective realization that they had all witnessed something rare, something powerful, something real. And then, as if on cue, a hand shot up in the back. One, just one. Hesitant, tentative, and then another, and another. Before long, applause began anew, slowly building, tentative at first, then swelling into a crescendo that filled every corner of the room. But it wasn't just applause. It was recognition. It was acknowledgement. It was a tangible expression of the way people had been touched, moved, inspired. Steve Harvey didn't shout over it. He didn't raise his voice. He let it grow, let it wash over him, let it remind him and everyone else why moments like this matter. Moments where time stops. Moments where a room full of strangers becomes a collective witness. Moments where a single human being can remind us of our shared humanity. And then, almost imperceptibly, people began to laugh softly, not out of amusement, but out of relief, joy, and a strange kind of gratitude. Some laughed through tears. Some laughed because they realized they had been holding their breath without even knowing it. And that laughter, mingling with the applause, became a symphony, a living, breathing testament to what had just occurred. Steve's eyes scanned the room one last time. Each person met his gaze for just a moment, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between them. A connection that was deeper than words, deeper than performance, deeper than fame. It was simple. It was human. It was unforgettable. The room had frozen once, and in that stillness, it had felt infinite. Then it had melted into applause, laughter, and shared recognition. And now, as the energy slowly settled, as breaths returned to normal, as hearts slowed their racing, the memory of that moment lingered. A quiet, potent reminder that sometimes, just sometimes, the ordinary becomes extraordinary. And Steve Harvey, he had been at the center of it all, a witness and a guide, quietly showing everyone how powerful one human connection can be. And then, as the applause tapered off, an almost sacred quiet returned to the room. It wasn't the awkward silence that follows an awkward moment. No, this was different. It was the kind of quiet that hangs heavy with reflection, with awareness, with shared understanding. People weren't shifting in their seats. They weren't whispering. They were simply being present, being part of something bigger than themselves. Steve Harvey looked around slowly, letting his gaze sweep over the audience. You could see it on his face, the calm satisfaction of a man who knew he had done something meaningful, not because he had to, not because it was expected, but because it was genuine. And in that gaze, everyone felt seen. Every single person, not as an audience member, not as a stranger, not as a number in a crowd, but as a human being sharing a moment that was fleeting and eternal at the same time. You see, he said softly, these are the moments that remind us who we are, not the ones on camera, not the ones we rehearse, not the ones we perform, but the ones that happen in between, the ones we feel, the ones that make us pause, make us reflect, make us connect. And the room responded not with applause at first, but with subtle, instinctive gestures. Heads nodded, eyes glistened. Some people even reached for the hands of those sitting next to them. There was a collective acknowledgement, unspoken but deeply felt, that what had just happened was special, that they had witnessed a rare kind of human authenticity, the kind that touches something inside you and stays there. Then, almost like a signal, a wave of clapping began. Tentative at first, small, polite, almost shy, and then, like a spark igniting dry tinder, it grew. The clapping swelled, filling the room, echoing off the walls, rolling like a tide that could not be stopped. And with it came laughter, sighs of relief, murmurs of amazement, and even a few soft tears. Steve Harvey stood in the middle, taking it all in, not raising his hands, not commanding, not performing, simply standing, watching, sharing, allowing the room to exist in this new state, a room transformed from passive observers to active participants in a moment of shared humanity. And in that silence, between the claps, between the laughter, you could feel it, the unspoken truth, that sometimes a single person, speaking honestly and being fully present, can remind an entire room, maybe even the world, of something essential, something worth remembering, something that cannot be captured in pictures, cannot be bottled in sound, cannot be fully explained, but can only be felt. Steve Harvey had frozen the room once with presence, and now, as the final echoes of applause faded and hearts slowed, the room was forever changed. People left with a memory etched into them, a reminder that the extraordinary can happen when we least expect it, in the simplest, most human of ways. And then, as the last echoes of applause faded into a gentle hum, the room was still again. But this time, it was a different kind of stillness, one filled with warmth, reflection, and an unspoken sense of shared experience. People weren't just witnessing anymore, they were part of it. They carried with them the memory of the pause, the connection, the understanding that had been created in that fleeting, extraordinary moment. Steve Harvey looked around one final time, letting his gaze meet as many eyes as possible. There was a soft smile on his face, a quiet gratitude, and a profound awareness that this right here was the essence of why he did what he did. Not for applause, not for recognition, not for fame, but for moments like this, moments that remind us that humanity, connection, and honesty still matter. He spoke one last time, his voice calm and measured, each word deliberate, sinking deep into the hearts of everyone present. "Remember this," he said. "Remember the silence. Remember the pause. Remember what it feels like to be truly present with one another. Because moments like this don't come every day, and when they do, they change us. They remind us who we are. They remind us that we are not alone, that we are connected, that life is better when we see, hear, and feel each other." A soft murmur ran through the room, people nodding, quietly affirming, almost afraid to break the spell. And then inevitably, applause began again. Not rushed, not chaotic, but measured, heartfelt, and deeply sincere. People stood, some clapping softly, some cheering, some wiping tears from their eyes. It wasn't just an audience responding, it was a collective human heartbeat, unified and alive. Steve Harvey let the applause flow around him, accepting it with humility and grace. And then, with a small nod and a knowing smile, he stepped back, allowing the room to release its energy, to breathe, to reflect. He had done more than speak. He had done more than perform. He had created a moment of connection, of humanity, of shared emotion that would linger long after the cameras were off, long after the lights dimmed, long after the doors closed. And in that moment, the lesson was clear. Sometimes all it takes is one person, fully present, fully authentic, to remind an entire room, or maybe even the world, of the extraordinary power of human connection. The room had frozen, and then it had applauded. And in between those two acts, something magical had happened. Everyone had witnessed the extraordinary in the ordinary. Everyone had been reminded that life is not just about what we do, but how we touch each other along the way. And as Steve Harvey walked off the stage, the memory of that moment stayed with everyone present, a quiet, enduring reminder that sometimes the most profound experiences happen in the silence, the pause, and the shared recognition of something greater than ourselves.